Okay, history of the DC-3. These are basic questions that I want you to pay attention to during the slide. There aren't going to be very many answers to these questions. They're just Matthew. Pardon? Yes? Just as they were a quiz, but there's no quiz tomorrow, it's the final exam. So there will be questions from this presentation on tomorrow. Okay, I want you to pay attention to the early design and manufacturing. From design to build, they built three versions, a DC-1, a DC-2, and the DC-3. The DC-1, there was only one ever built, and it was used as the prototype for the next iteration, which was the DC-2. The modifications were a little bit stronger engine horsepower, a little bit bigger wing, slightly larger fuselage to go from the DC-1 to the DC-2. So then they started selling DC-2s. Then along came an airline and said, hey, we have to have a little bit bigger airplane, goes a longer way, has more powerful engines. We need a new version. And Mr. Douglas said, no, I don't think so. And the airline said, if you don't, we'll buy them from somebody else, or we'll look around and see what else we can use. So Douglas relented and went ahead and designed the DC-3, and it became wildly popular. In the meantime, World War II interrupted, and so the military decided to use the DC-3 as a heavy hauler of weapons, of personnel, of parachutists, paratroopers, literally by the thousands. DC-3s were used also to haul gliders across the English Channel on D-Day. And if you're not familiar with D-Day, it was the first time that the Allies in World War II had invaded the European continent. And at that moment in time, they landed in France, but France was completely occupied by the Germans, by the Nazis. I just answered that question a couple of minutes ago. Has there ever been a structural failure? The answer is no. I expect you to be looking at the presentation, and I'm going to show you some numbers also that you want to write down. These are important questions about the DC-3, and likely some or all of them will appear on the test tomorrow. So here's the DC-3 used by the airlines in a 10-year period of time, and you can see the DC-3. Yes. The chart that I'm going to show you has a list of the numbers of aircraft used by the airlines in a period from 1946 to 1950, I believe, something like that, or 1956. But we'll go back and take a look at it in a minute. But it's important to note how significant the DC-3 was in terms of use by the airlines. Everybody ready now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, take a look at the DC-3 from 46 to 50 to 55, a 10-year period. But down at the bottom is a number you're going to want to write down, because that number at the time was so phenomenal in terms of all the other aircraft ever built. And so what happened was they started building the DC-3, and then the war came along, and the Army said, hey, or Air Force said, you know, we want those. Stop building them for the airlines and build them for the military. So Douglas had no choice. They had to. The Douglas facilities were in two places. Most of the aircraft were built at Santa Monica Airport, of all places. Then they moved to huge facilities when they were building the jets, the Douglas jets, the DC-10, the DC-8, the DC-9. They moved to Long Beach. They were on the Long Beach airport. No, a total of more than 16,000 DC-3s were built. But you can see the disparity. More than 10,000 of them were for the military. And they called it the C-47. The difference between the DC-3 and the C-47 was fairly minor. A little bit heavier landing gear, a little bit larger cargo door, a little bit something stressed inside, something built a little stronger. But mainly it was the identical aircraft, but it was termed the C-47 by the military. So, and I'm not sure why these pictures didn't come out sharper, because they were very, very large megabyte. They were 30 megabyte pictures. When I took these pictures at O'Hare Airport, and see a fleet of DC-3 for a particular airline. Here I am waiting to go from St. Louis to my school at Columbia, Missouri, when I was working on my PhD at University of Missouri. I used to fly in those all the time from St. Louis to, and sometimes from Chicago to St. Louis, depending on whether they used the DC-3 or they used the Fairchild F-27. So I thought I'd show you some pictures that we had talked about before, some things we've covered in the past. This is my picture of my going out to O'Hare Airport when they had an open aviation day in 1958 after I got out of the Army. This was the absolute original first Boeing 707 ever, and it was used as a demonstrator, and then it was used as an advertisement for the airlines to buy it, and because it was being converted into a passenger jet. That particular aircraft is mainly hollow inside, but that's because when aircraft are sold by Boeing, they are usually completed in the interior by other companies. It was quite a thrill for everyone to go out there and for the first time in our lives to see an aircraft that was powered by jet engines. It was hard to believe. You know, we knew there were jet engines out there. We knew there was a de Havilland Comet. We knew that there were other aircraft around the world, some of which were powered by jet. But to be able to go out to an airport like O'Hare and be able to walk around and then get inside the interior of a Boeing 707 was just one of those lifetime things you probably would never forget. We had talked about flaps before, and we had talked about the fact there are multiple kinds of flaps. Fowler flaps are such that they are built inside the wing so that at high speed they're retracted and they don't cause a lot of drag, parasite drag, right? When it comes in for a landing, you will see these flaps start coming out of the wing horizontally, and then they start bending down to provide a virtual fat wing. Remember, the better the wing, the better the lift, but the worse the parasite drag. So when you're coming in for a landing, going at a high speed, what you care about is lift. You're already at slow speed, and you care about lift, so the Fowler flap comes out and curves down like that. Fully deflected Fowler flap there and here, and those are speed brakes. So it's one of those amazing designs that somebody came up with. Maybe, I don't know, but they're called Fowler flaps, and they're built inside the wing of most high-speed commercial airliners. Designed a nice little ship. I've flown on the Caravel. It was a craft. It was comfortable. It was fairly quiet compared to some of the other early jets. People liked it, but it wasn't the kind of aircraft that really survived because it didn't have the capacity or the range or the speed of aircraft that Boeing and Douglas were building at the time. But it was a nice aircraft. The story behind this is that when United Airlines first was the launch customer for the 737, people made fun of it because it was as fat as a Boeing 707, the fuselage was. It was as fat as the 727, but here it was with two little engines. And everybody called it Fat Albert because they literally didn't believe that it would ever have a future. Today, it is the largest selling commercial aircraft in history. It's also surpassed the DC-3. As you know, Southwest Airlines, that's all they fly. All over the world, Southwest Airlines flies just 737. So did PSA, so did Air California, so did Braniff Airlines, so do many, many current airlines, because it sort of fits a niche. You know, the airline business has transformed itself from starting out, everybody had to have fast jets. Then all of a sudden they decided they wanted more people in it. Then they decided they want a hub and spoke distribution where they would bring everybody into one big airport like O'Hare, and then they would go out in a spoke pattern to smaller airports. Then they decided that all of a sudden, gee, maybe that little aircraft, if we put better engines on it, maybe it could solve the problem of not only capacity, but also hub and spoke. So today, the largest selling aircraft in the world, but at the time it was ridiculed. Everybody thought it was one of those things we talked about before, where an idea was ahead of its time. It was for a while until it really caught on, and the industry sort of transformed to the 737. Douglas built the DC-10, and in the video you're going to see, you will also see they'll be matching up the DC-3 with the DC-10 because they were both built by the same company, Douglas Aircraft. Here's the flight line where I learned to fly. Matthew? There? More? Where do you want? What about it? Is there an engine up in the tail? Well, they would put 4 engines on because the engines at those days were strong enough so that they could actually carry the weight and the speed with just 3 engines, right? So Douglas decided to put it up in the vertical tail. Lockheed built what they called TriStar, and had it embedded in the rear of the cabin. So they had one on each wing and one in the cabin. And that was very similar to the 727. Remember, Boeing came out with the 727 first with 3 engines. And the way they designed it is manufacturers tried to go later on. Continuing Boeing's force of how do you build aircraft, how do you build sized aircraft, how do you build features like 3 engines. Understand that Boeing is just a phenomenal company. In Tucson, Arizona, if you ever have a chance to overfly Tucson or visit a car, make sure you go to the Davis-Monthan Graveyard, the Air Force Base. These are aircraft that came out of World War II or the Korean War or the Vietnam War that they didn't need anymore, so they take them and they put them out there, and either they sell them to the public, or they use them for spare parts, or they just sit there forever in the sunshine and the heat of the desert. But look at these. Look at the number of aircraft sitting there. Huge 4-engine Boeing 747s. Andrew? Yeah, there are some aircraft you could buy out of Davis-Monthan. Correct. It used to be that you could buy P-51s for some ridiculous price. You know, now they're worth $1.2 million or something. But you could buy them for $50,000. But look at the aircraft sitting there at Davis-Monthan. Here are more of them. Big swept-wing fighters and early fighters and bombers. It's just an amazing place to see from the air. Here's O'Hare, Boeing 747s, Korean Air in the distance. I don't know which one that is over on the side there. I don't know what airline that is. This one right here. But here's an American, looks like a 767, or maybe that's even a 737. No, the engines are too big. And by the way, if you notice 737, It's very characteristic. It's so low to the ground that instead of the engines being round like that, they're round and then they're flattened at the bottom. A company called CFM 56, Snecma engine manufacturer in France, designed a specific engine for the 737 that has a flat bottom so that it has more clearance over the runway. 747s of Qantas Airline. Everybody remember what country owns Qantas? Australia, yeah. Queensland and Aerial Territories and Northern Territories Aerial Service. There are 4 big 747s of Qantas Airlines. Now, that's not O'Hare. That's Los Angeles International. Sorry. That's LA International. So disregard that glaring mistake. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the video. Sit back, relax. Remember, there are some notes you're going to want to take during the video itself.
Years ago, an airplane took off in California, and the concept of air travel would never be the same. The DC-3, the plane that helped the airlines grow and taught the public to fly, that helped win World War II and lived on to perform service around the world today. Come meet that airplane, the DC-3, and the people behind it.
Emergency exit light, armed, thrust computer, set for takeoff, spoiler handle, it's armed.
The cockpit of a DC-10 with its 3-member flight crew. As the huge 250-ton jet moves toward the runway at Boston's Logan Airport, its crew run through their usual pre-flight checklist.
They're on and checked. Packs and pneumatic supplies, set, check.
Dozens of systems are checked and checked again to ensure that this product of modern technology is ready to fly. But suddenly, across the field like a phantom out of time, a little twin-propeller DC-3 scurries by. And in its cockpit, its 2-man crew is engaged in its own pre-flight check.
Okay, have to start. First flight, steer on, curve switch, shift, hydraulics, up and up, hanging.
A vision from another age, but still a very real part of the working scene today.
Hydraulic pressure, up there.
A living reminder that this 50-year-old classic is the grandfather to today's modern behemoths. As the DC-10 crew maneuvers closer to the runway, they check through their final items.
Takeoff TA, it's on. Takeoff checklist is complete.
And soon behind it, its little ancestor also falls into position.
Oh, looking good. Final 4 to go. Okay.
This jet-age giant, carrying nearly 300 passengers, a testament to the modern era of commercial transport. But air travel today, so much a part of our lives. It's easy to forget in many ways it all started only 50 years ago, here in the DC-3. The plane that made it possible, the plane that helped the airlines grow and taught the public to fly. And now, in its 50th anniversary year, through the winds of history, that very plane has emerged, still playing a bright, active role in our world today. There's possibly no finer tribute for the DC-3, the plane that changed the world. From here in Anchorage, Alaska, DC-3s are being used today by a company named Salair Air Cargo. Their mission is to fly to remote landing strips and pick up fish for processing back in the city. Bill Hartman is a retired United Airlines pilot, currently flying 2 of Salair's DC-3s.
I flew with United Airlines for 36 years, flying the various airplanes which they had. I ended up retiring from the 747 airplane.
Captain Hartman originally flew DC-3s with United back in the early 40s.
When you first get back in an airplane like this out of jets, it does seem a bit old-fashioned. Once you're in it again, it becomes as rock solid as it was before, and you like the sound and the feel, and it feels very comfortable and very, very home-like again. It's really a home in the air. And the sounds and feels of this airplane it's old-fashioned, but at the same time it's never old either. You never get tired of it. It makes music as you fly almost.
Salair's headquarters are found south of here, in the shadows of Mount Rainier in Seattle, Washington. It was several years ago when this unusual operation got started.
But my point is this: somebody has to do the marketing here as well as in Vancouver, because the...
Joe and Edie Salerno retired from long flying careers with Pan Am back in 1977. Today they're running their own airline, along with their sons Bruce and Paul.
John's going to market.
But back when they retired, Edie and Joe were off to spend their lives touring America in their Airstream trailer.
Fine. Great.
Okay, it's decided. What do you think, Dave?
Salair originally started in 1979 when I got a job hauling fish as a co-pilot mechanic on a DC-3 in Alaska. I learned a lot about the business that first summer, and then the summer of 1980 I had graduated from college, and my brother Bruce and I were discussing what we were going to do with our lives.
And we came to a determination that if anybody at all could make a success of running an old airplane in cargo operations, both of us being pilots and both of us being mechanics, we would be able to do it.
Bruce suggested that we purchase a DC-3 and take it to Alaska and haul fish.
We knew that we could not get our folks' approval on something like this, so we waited until they had gone on an extended vacation, and we searched the West Coast and found in Oakland our first DC-3 aircraft.
So one day we called home and the boys said, things are going great. And we said, well, what's happening? And they said, well, we bought an airplane today. And we said, an airplane? How big? Thinking maybe it was like a Cessna or something like this. And they said, well, we bought a DC-3.
So when we returned, they greeted me with, well, Dad, here's the key to the airplane. I says, you've got to be crazy. Do you have any spare parts? They said, no. Do you have any spare money? No. You have spare engine? No. So I walked off and didn't talk to him for 3 weeks.
He was pretty upset.
We tried to get my dad to come to Alaska initially, our first summer in 1980, but he was not interested and not receptive to the idea. However, when we did get back in September and paid off a substantial portion of our initial debt, he was quite pleased.
I started to work for him full time, sometimes 6 days, 7 days a week. We did all the maintenance, we did all the repair work, and the boys did all the flying.
And their work paid off. Today, with 11 DC-3s, they've expanded beyond their summertime Alaska operation to year-round contracts with several large air freight carriers. Salair takes cargo from these large jets in Seattle and flies it to smaller airports, where it makes sense to operate planes which cost only $125,000. Their machines stayed up for 12 full seconds. Progress came quickly. By 1909, they were demonstrating a twin-engine catapult-launched tube and canvas machine in sustained flight. The Wright brothers used the new science of aerodynamics to pull their flyer into the air. Every airplane designer has to understand how a particular shape called an airfoil will generate lift as the air stream is forced to flow more rapidly over the long upper surface. World War I, airplanes found their first widespread practical use. The aerobatics of dogfighting became a familiar image, but airplanes were still inefficient machines. These biplanes were burdened with 200-pound engines producing only 150 horsepower, so speeds were slow. Slow speed means low lift, only enough in this case to carry the plane and 2 people aloft. The struts and wires produced high drag. Trying to increase speed to get more lift, drag would increase as well. But in the post-war years, aerodynamic victories were about to change the world. The Europeans were first to start a system of mail and passenger services. By late 1919, flying daily between London and Paris. Larger planes were essential, and 4 key technical areas were being tackled: structures, aerodynamics, engines, and instruments.
Development went ahead in those 4 areas at a pace which resulted in a level of technology by 1935 which could be incorporated in the DC-3.
In structures, the crucial advance was the step from externally braced biplanes with their struts and wires to the cantilever or internally braced monoplane. There was an immediate reduction in weight and in air resistance or drag. With drag reduced for a given engine power, the aircraft could fly faster, generate more lift, and carry a greater load, maybe even a paying load. And the passengers did pay. European governments subsidized air travel, but you still had to be experienced far above the reach of the average citizen. But as more Europeans flew, the public became aware of airplane capabilities and limitations. In the early 20s, pilots could fly only in good weather. They navigated by visual reference, with just a map to guide them. Navigational instruments were needed, but not yet available. Without visible landmarks below, they couldn't fly. For the European public, this could mean delayed or diverted service. In America, there was virtually no passenger service. The post office was first to find a use for planes, establishing airmail in 1918, and several fledgling airlines began to make their living in the 20s from government mail contracts. Flying in all weather, day and night, with primitive instruments and numerous crashes, the public was convinced flying was a dangerous business. But one airmail pilot, Charles Lindbergh, changed the public's perception. It was 1927. Flying non-stop across the Atlantic in nearly 24 hours, he fired the public imagination with thoughts of safe, long-distance travel. And as ideas about flying were changing, so was airplane technology. That same year, the Lockheed Vega appeared. With several remarkable features, it used, like Lindbergh's plane, a lightweight air-cooled radial engine, the high technology of the 20s.
This engine made possible a very much more efficient airplane because the weight of the airplane was reduced in going from the heavy old engines to these new air-cooled radials. The power developed was enormously increased, and the reliability and economy of operation of the engines all were greatly improved.
The first Vegas flew at 135 miles per hour, with considerable drag from the blunt surface of the radial engine. While more people were flying, the total number was still small. The Great Depression was on and air travel was expensive. Passenger capacity on the planes was tiny, and the airlines eked out a profit only from the government subsidy they received for the mail they carried. Then, tragedy for the airlines. 1931, a TWA wood and metal Fokker trimotor flying into severe icing in Kansas crashed. Among the wreckage, inspectors found signs that the wooden ribs of a wing had been rotting. One of its passengers was Newt Rockney, the beloved coach who had put his Notre Dame team on the map. As the nation mourned his loss, the Civil Aeronautics Authority drafted new regulations for the inspection of wooden aircraft. It was a turning point beyond which the commercial aircraft then being used had no future. Jack Fry was TWA Vice President of Operations, and he faced a dilemma. He needed something better than the wood structure Fokker, and his competitor United Airlines was proudly introducing the all-metal Boeing 247. It was a stressed skin monoplane with 2 cowled engines, faster than the Fokker by 70%. Although the 247 represented the first truly modern plane of its era, the design contained shortcomings. It had only 10 seats, and the cabin was obstructed by 2 wing spars across the aisle. In any case, the initial production of the Boeing was earmarked for United Airlines, Jack Fry's rival, so he could not obtain them. The best he had available was the much slower all-metal Ford trimotor. TWA did the best it could to convince the public of the Ford's acceptability.
Of them would be deadheads. They would be for publicity purposes or friends of somebody or other. The airlines faced bankruptcy. They had to have a completely new airplane that would carry more passengers, carry them faster, with dependability and the potential of making money.
Jack Fry was desperate for something better than the Fords, and with a Boeing 247 unavailable, he wrote a letter to 5 airplane manufacturers of the time, a letter that would change aviation history. He requested them to design a plane which would surpass the Boeing and would take fullest advantage of the best technology of the day. In Santa Monica, Donald W. Douglas was one of the recipients of Jack Fry's letter. Douglas was one of the better-known aviation designers at the time, and his small company had primarily been manufacturing military planes. Arthur Raymond was assistant chief engineer in the shop in those days, soon to become one of the principal designers of the DC-1, 2, and 3 series.
When we received the letter from Jack Fry, Doug called in the design team, and within, I would say, a week, we had the 3-view drawing made. We had performance estimates made. We knew about cost and delivery, and we were ready to submit the proposal.
The team's proposal was for a bimotor, not the tri-motor Fry had asked for. It was an important departure from the original request.
We disliked the idea of a tri-motor so much that we never even considered it.
The nose engine and the tri-motors, in my opinion, was a curse. It introduced into the structure of the fuselage and the passenger cabin the unpleasantness of vibration, noise, odor, and the hazard of fire.
But Fry had requested 3 engines for a reason. At the time, pilots were used to flying tri-motors, which gave them a sense of security. If one engine failed in flight at high altitude, there were still 2 others to get them down safely. Charles Lindbergh was a technical advisor to TWA. Shown here inspecting an engine factory, he was especially concerned with issues of engine reliability. For the new design, he insisted on an airplane that could meet the strict test of being able to cross the Rockies, the highest part of TWA's route, at a safe altitude with 1 engine dead. It was a challenge for the Douglas team, who proposed a large plane with only 2 engines. But aware of the increases in engine horsepower, the advances in streamlining and aerodynamics, the invention of instrument aids, they had faith in their design, which rapidly brought together the best advances of the past decade.
Once we had the preliminary design done, I was chosen as assistant chief engineer to go east to New York and confer with TWA, together with Harry Wetzel, who's our executive vice president and business manager. We decided, because there had been quite a number of airline accidents about that time, and because we really wanted to get there, to go by train. My discussions were mainly with Lindbergh, who in general seemed to be favorably inclined, except that he was worried about the single-engine flight problem. Tell the truth, I was too. But in spite of my skepticism, I was optimistic. And we were all optimistic, because by golly, we wanted to do it.
And within a few months, they were doing it. A contract was signed and the Douglas Commercial 1, or the DC-1, was underway. But throughout construction, the team worried whether the recently available more powerful engines could really do the job to lift this large 12-passenger plane. From different manufacturers were being considered for the contract. The Wright Company's Cyclone, 710 horsepower, in testing was experiencing cylinder cooling problems. And the Pratt & Whitney Hornet, 700 horsepower, which was having trouble with oil consumption. These engines represented the latest improvements in power plant technology, the most advanced horsepower of their day. After intense testing, the contract went to the Wright Company, which at the last moment redesigned the cylinders, although in later years, Pratt & Whitney won back the business. Meanwhile, at the other end of Los Angeles, Bailey Oswald was involved with developments taking place at Caltech. In Pasadena, a new 200-mile-per-hour wind tunnel was being used in the developing science of aerodynamics. A surprisingly simple device, still in use today, it offered a more direct approach to design than the theoretical charts and graphs which had been used previously. Bailey Oswald was a recent graduate here when he was hired by Arthur Raymond to run the original tests on the DC-1, 2, and 3 series.
Starting with DC-1, I think that we began to bring aerodynamics out into the open and make it all-inclusive, important asset to the airplane. And it happened, in fact, that I came in 1932 and was a single aerodynamicist in the company at that time. And as time went on, the aerodynamics section was built up to, during the wartime, I believe as many as 200 people.
The DC-1, 2, and 3 were each aerodynamically tested in the same way. A model was hung upside down in the tunnel to make it easier for the aerodynamicists to make their measurements. A fan in the tunnel generates wind, and as air flows over the wings, its aerodynamic lift will be in a downward direction towards the tunnel floor. As it flies, it pulls down on the wires supporting it. These wires extend through the tunnel ceiling into a balance room above, where they are attached to a series of scales. Each scale measures a different force on the model. For example, lift, drag, thrust. And once the model stabilizes in the wind, the aerodynamicist collects the data in the form of a numerical readout on each scale, ultimately translating those readouts into finely tuned graphs and equations which will modify design.
As a result of these kind of wind tunnel tests, we learned many things that we took advantage of during the design. In order to make it possible,
the idea was to stretch the fuselage by almost 2 feet so that 2 more seats could be added, bringing the carrying capacity to 14 passengers and giving the airline a chance to make more money. Greater comfort. The Condors had the room to accommodate 14 Pullman-style berths, but they were slow and old-fashioned. At the time of the DC-2, C.R. Smith, shown here with Eleanor Roosevelt, had just begun his 30-year command as president of American Airlines. Together with his chief engineer, Bill Littlewood, he wanted to get rid of the Condors and update the sleeper service. The late Bill Littlewood recalls.
C.R. Smith and I went to Donald Douglas and had conversations concerning what might be done to the DC-2 to make it into the kind of an airplane we were seeking.
What they envisioned was a larger plane that would be a modern 14-passenger sleeper and at the same time could give them the option to carry as many as 21 passengers in a daytime configuration. This would be accomplished by widening the DC-2 fuselage 26 inches to accommodate another row of seats and increasing the wingspan by 10 feet to give the greater lift needed for the plane's additional size and weight. At the time, Donald Douglas was heavily involved with DC-2 production. His initial reaction to Americans' plan was not favorable.
Doug was not too enthusiastic about the idea of introducing a new model when our shop was full of orders for DC-2s. But C.R. convinced him.
we told Douglas we'd take the first 20 airplanes he developed and pay for them. And that they was very influential. Because 20 was a bigger order in those days. 20 was a bigger order in those days than 200 would be now.
Building began, and C.R. Smith collaborated closely with the Douglas Design Department, where Arthur Raymond was now in charge as chief engineer. As the plane took shape, the designers once again incorporated the great sturdiness of the monocoque fuselage, with now even lighter weight aluminum alloys employed in its all-metal stressed skin. The great strength of the multicellular wing.
That was in earlier lectures and a quiz.
And the wind tunnel tested streamlined surfaces to reduce drag and increase speed. Finally, on December 17, 1935, the 32nd anniversary of the Wright brothers' first flight, C.R. Smith got what he and the world's airlines had been hoping for. The first DC-3, the Douglas sleeper transport version, was quietly test-flown over the Santa Monica factory. In structure and design, it had the basic excellence of the DC-1 and the DC-2. But it also improved on them. It became the crown jewel of the series. A stronger landing gear would give it more rugged performance on rough airstrips. These newly available 1,000 horsepower engines made it feasible to build a plane whose increased size and weight was a clear impossibility just 2 years before. The new engines, along with the additional 10-foot wingspan, combined to lift this jumbo wide body of its time with the necessary speed and power to transport people in a new world of comfort and safety, the likes of which had never before been experienced in aviation. Since passenger planes were still not pressurized, flight was limited to 10 or 12,000 feet, where turbulence could still be considerable. As a result, in its design, C.R. Smith had emphasized all aspects of comfort in order to attract passengers. In the daytime version, with its 21 adjustable seats, its sound insulation, its decent steam heating and ventilation, its light colors, its tall ceiling, and in the nighttime sleeper version with its 14 berths, comfort was everything.
Your ship flies steadily, smoothly through the quiet of the night. Within the American Sky Sleeper, you have a soft, luxurious berth. It may be a sweltering night for earth dwellers, when people sit up all night long because they cannot sleep. But up here you sleep under blankets.
Stewardesses became a routine part of the flying scene to tuck people in, physically as well as psychologically.
Up here in the Sky Sleeper, you're cozy and warm. You breathe air swept clean by the winds of the world, while the purring motors lull you to sleep.
Of all people, now how did you get that?
Well,
isn't that beautiful? And it brings it all back.
This is service that was used on the DC-3 sleeper.
Oh, that's...
See this. This is that body of the airplane. You must remember that. That's
yes, but I haven't seen it for so many years.
A reunion of 3 of the first American Airlines stewardesses.
Yeah. We served plenty to them, but it wasn't.
And they always got free cigarettes.
Phoebe King got her wings from C.R. Smith in the class of '39, in the days when flying was still something new and special.
On Sunday nights when I took there were many people behind the fence, and we had to check in over at the hangar and walk across the airport to our plane. And as we went by the fence, they would hand us their autograph books. And then they'd ask us questions, how long does it take to get to Newark and all this sort of thing.
Lillian Fetty, like her colleagues, had originally trained as a nurse, a requirement for all stewardesses at the time.
They wanted capable, trained, disciplined people on the airplane so that any of the passengers, if it was their first flight, or if it was a rough flight, or if they were nervous, we were capable of instilling confidence in them.
Air sick?
We don't mention that.
Marge Markley began her service on the DC-2s and was there when the DC-3s arrived.
There were 21 passengers on the plane if it was full, and most of them were business people that flew maybe 5 or 6 times a month, and you really got to know them, so it was a very personal type relationship there.
Where are we now? We're flying over Dearborn, Michigan. We left Chicago here about an hour ago and flew right along here. And now if you look out the window, you can begin to see Detroit below us. Oh, Barry, look.
Yep, there she is.
With the galley installed on the DC-3s, hot meals were now available for the first time to the flying public.
Fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, and peas, and maybe a little salad. That was standard fare. It would be lunch or dinner.
DC-3 itself was just a gorgeous plane, and of course we felt that the future was in flying. I think we all felt that because it seemed so luxurious to us that we had food and drink and all those things on it, meaning coffee and soup and these things for the passengers. And we felt so secure and safe in this DC-3.
The plane's comforts made it a great popular success, but it also became known for its modern instruments and safety.
Captain, do you have time to explain the radio beam to Mrs. Cole?
Really? We fly the highways of the air, Mrs. Cole, the same as you fly the highways on the ground. Ours is a highway of sound.
Oh, yes.
About 2 hours ago, we left Chicago here. We're headed for New York here. The Civil Aeronautics Authority maintains radio range stations along the route at frequent intervals, broadcasting a constant highway of sound, which we call the beam.
You either heard an A, dit-da, dit-da, if you were one side of the beam. If you were on the other side of the beam, you got a da, dit, da, dit. When you were right down the groove, as we used to say, you heard this constant hum. And listening to that hour after hour became very, very, very tedious.
I have no idea. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That's quite all right. The pleasure's mine. I hope to have you passengers again soon.
He's not.
I flew the DC-3 as long as any one pilot, many hundreds of hours, and I considered it a nice airplane to fly. It was fully controllable in all respects, had excellent stability, perfect response to the controls, and it was just simply no other airplane that competed with it.
Well, in general, I'd say the DC-3 was a design you wouldn't want to change anything in. It was exactly what you wanted.
The designers loved it. Pilots loved it. Passengers loved it. And especially the airlines loved it.
Well, I'm very proud of the DC-3 because it lived up to the best of our expectations and exceeded them.
For the first time, there was an airplane with which the airlines could make money without depending upon subsidy. Passenger travel alone. And this is what we'd all been waiting for.
By 1939, over 400 had been built. It became the standard of the industry, carrying 80% of domestic passenger traffic and huge numbers elsewhere in the world. While its success worked magic for the airlines, there was truly nothing magic about its design. It was just the shrewd combination of the best available technology at the right time, in the right size of vehicle, with the right performance for the operators of the period. And too, there would soon be so many of them. With America's entrance in the war in California, the Douglas factory was hard at work with growing orders for military air transports. The DC-3 had so impressed the U.S. Army Air Corps, they decided to use it as a basic troop and cargo carrier. With only slight modifications, a larger cargo door, beefed up floors, a stronger landing gear, the DC-3 went into service as the C-47 in the Army or the R-4D in the Navy and Marine Corps. At peak production, they were manufactured at the rate of 2 per hour, and by war's end, an astounding 10,174 of them were built, opening a new chapter in the way troops and materiel could be moved during combat. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The greatest fleet of DC-3s ever assembled, making possible the largest air invasion force in history. 20,000 paratroops and supplies carried across the channel in the first 50 hours. Known variously as Sky Troopers, Dakotas, Sky Trains, 1,200 of them flying 4 abreast in a column 200 miles long. And their solid presence was felt around the world. The island-hopping campaign in the Pacific would never have been possible without it. The workhorse of the air, whose nicknames Goonie Bird, the Doug, Old Fatso seemed never to end, moved vehicles, weapons, supplies. It rescued the wounded, and for thousands of GIs, it was the first aircraft they'd ever flown in. With its special talent to take off and land on short, rugged airstrips, the plane was tested to its limits and beyond.
The Japanese were coming in at the south end of the city, and the airport was at the north end. And we weren't able to get gas. The gasoline people had left, but while we were there, quite a few Burmese came aboard. When we arrived at Calcutta, we found that our total complement in the cabin was 72, most of them, of course, small, many babies, and when they opened the baggage compartment, they found 4 more in there. 76 people on a DC-3. That's a pretty good load.
No wonder that by the war's end, Eisenhower would credit the DC-3 as being one of the pieces of equipment most responsible for Allied victory in World War II. In the years following 1945, the many thousands of war surplus DC-3s were converted in great number from military to commercial passenger use. But it wasn't long before the DC-3s were soon passed over by the airlines, which saw greater profits in newer designs, designs which grew out of the DC-3, grew out of its all-sea. It was an era of pressurized planes which could comfortably fly above the weather, could fly faster with higher-powered engines, and could carry more people. With the advent of jets in the 60s, it seemed certain the DC-3 would die, while only its traditions continued. The last DC-3 was built in 1946, yet strangely today, the plane has lived on to find a niche for itself in the world. For someone with no ability to fix up an old one like the Salernos did with their cargo operation, it's possible to buy virtually new ones in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. DC-3s are for sale at Bassler Flight Service. Warren Bassler's company is refurbishing planes to meet individual needs, whether for cargo or passenger use. The aircraft are restored almost to mint condition, and he's currently doing his 59th DC-3.
Strange as it may seem, the demand today is greater than it was when we started in our business 30 years ago. And the airplane is still one of the best airplanes for hauling freight and even hauling people. It does more for what it costs you to operate than any other airplane you can buy today.
Bassler scours the world for DC-3s, most recently buying 7 from the French Navy in New Caledonia.
We try to find the best airframes that are available, and if you have a clean airframe to start with, the rest is easy.
Any signs of corrosion are replaced by new sections, individually cut and fitted, preserving the immense strength of the plane as it was originally designed. In its history, there has never been a structural failure of the DC-3. Interiors are made over completely, down to the last details of new seats, insulation, paneling, reinforced floors. Modern instruments are added, bringing the plane up to date with the latest flying and navigational aids. Finally, with reconditioned engines installed and tested, an almost new DC-3 becomes available to any who want to enter the business.
The reason that we stay in the DC-3 business is because of the cost being $175,000 to $300,000 for a freighter ready to go for someone starting in the freight business versus a couple million for anything else that would do the job for them.
It's 5 a.m. in Hyannis, Massachusetts, and Provincetown Boston Airlines' fleet of 4 different types of airplanes sits out on the Cape Cod grass like a flock of birds awaiting its mid-morning activity. Passengers leaving Hyannis for Boston or Provincetown, Martha's Vineyard or Nantucket may be surprised to find they're going to be flying in an airplane designed 50 years ago. But the DC-3s are an essential part of PBA's fleet, and it was no matter of chance that the company's founder, John Van Arsdale, began buying them back in 1968.
I never bought an airplane in the history of my operation of the company because I liked it. I bought an airplane because I thought it could make money. The DC-3 fulfills that objective. We didn't pay a great deal of money for them, and therefore we could afford to park them and operate them whenever they were needed.
Today, PBA flies 12 DC-3s along with 3 other types of aircraft, and scheduling is done according to demand. The right size plane is dispatched for the right size load.
Operations Central.
The dispatcher's pet names for the planes help relieve the frantic pace of scheduling.
Due to the overload, we'll use a DC-3 to Boston. We'll give them dragon wagon service.
After we bought a DC-3 for about $20,000, we might put $50,000 or $100,000 into it. But we had a great airplane for $120,000 or $150,000. Completely redid them all over, and when it flew, it made money.
Chief Pilot Anthony Freitas is performing a routine inspection of this plane before going aloft, examining the entire exterior for any possible surface irregularities. It's a standard procedure for any plane, but this plane is special.
36 PV here is the highest time DC-3 in the world. It's the highest time airliner in the world. It's got over 88,000 hours on it right now. It passed the one that's hanging in the Smithsonian some time ago. Every time it goes out, it sets a new record. It's sort of the queen of the fleet to us. It's our pride and joy. For PBA, it's really the perfect airplane for our operation. We generally fly shorter legs than the major airlines do, so the fact that the airplane's half the speed or less of a modern jet doesn't really bother us. The trip lengths are still only going to be a half an hour. We don't suffer at all there. And the airplane gives us the ability to take 30 people at a whack out of a very small field that any other airplane just wouldn't allow us to do. In a modern jet, you cruise anywhere from something in the area of 30,000 feet. In a DC-3, we're generally cruising at about a tenth of that altitude. So you're a lot closer to the ground. There's a lot more scenery down there. Generally, it's a lot more enjoyable to fly down at that altitude. You fly from here to Boston, and if you fly over a football field, you get time to see a play beyond the fact that it's a football field that might be down there from 30,000 feet. You don't just sit in a DC-3 and let things happen. And for sheer activity in the cockpit, I guess there is quite a bit more than there would be in a 727 or something of that nature. The gear is a good example. 727, if you want to put the gear down, you throw one lever down. And a DC-3, you have to throw one hydraulic lever down, wait for the pressure to build up in the gauges, and then throw a lock latch in place, return the hydraulic lever to the center position, and then for the heck of it, you stick your head out the window and make sure it's stuck down. You try that for 727, you lose your head.
The plane is flown at 155 miles per hour, and with the Boston runway in view, speed is cut to 95, enabling it to land in 1/10 the space needed for a modern jet.
Well, the airplane was built to fly at a slower speed. As a result, it's always being affected by the environment, by the winds that are on the airport itself, or by a jet blast from a passing airplane or something, whereas a modern airplane, a 727, once it's on the ground, essentially becomes a truck. You start steering it. This airplane, you've got to fly continually all the way to the gate and shut down the engines and wait for them to lock the controls before you give it up as an airplane. There is no airplane today that will replace it for what we use it for on a short haul out of a short airport. There's nothing that even comes close. And any airplane that can do what this thing does and did for the airlines and for us is just, there's no question, it's a superior aircraft.
After 50 years, more than 1,000 DC-3s are still flying the skies of the world.
DC-3 has been called a very well-loved airplane. I think that comes about through the fact that there were so many of them, and so many people have experienced travel in the DC-3, some of it under rather arduous and dangerous conditions, and come through unscathed. So there are a lot of stories that accumulate about the good old DC-3, the Goonie Bird, and so forth, with a feeling of affection. Also, you kind of feel affection for somebody that's as old as a DC-3. I hope.